Wait.
Boing.
All right. You guys ready?
Yo.
Yeah, why not?
All right. Hey, all. Welcome to the Skeptic Hangout, the place where we sit back, relax, and chat about intriguing and sometimes controversial topics through the lens of skepticism. With us today is Richard Gilliver from the Skeptic Takeout, Laura McGee from Unapologetically Me, and Richard Gill from the Yorkshire Atheist. Before we go any further, do us a favor. Hit that like and subscribe button to help us grow and do great things with this podcast.
Please don't click on it. Don't click on it. Don't tap on it. Hit it.
Hit that subscribe button. Today, we are going to be talking about authority. Hit that subscribe button. So grab your English tea or your toasted almond latte with light foam and join us for a conversation about why I should be seen as the grand empress of the known universe. Okay, just kidding. This is episode 30, authority. Hey, who's in charge around here anyway? I've got questions.
How do you toast a latte, by the way? Toasted what?
Toasted almond latte.
Oh, right. Okay, so the almonds are toasted, not the latte. I was confused about that.
You could toast the latte too, right? I don't know.
I don't suppose that would work very well.
You could smoke the latte.
Could you not pour it on one of those sandwich makers and then compress it and...
Yeah.
I mean, give somebody the challenge and they'll make it happen.
We've all got hot drinks today, though, which tells us that autumn is approaching.
This is a cold drink in a hot drink cup.
Oh, that's sneaky.
Doesn't that blow your mind? All right. So authority. And I can't help but mention that as soon as I knew that this was today's topic, the first thing that I thought of was South Park and Cartman. So all I've got stuck in my head is, you will respect my authority. That's all I got to say on the matter.
South Park.
I've watched a moderate amount of South Park, enough to understand the reference, and I know the character. I've got a very vivid image in my mind.
Nice.
Yeah, authority is a funny one, isn't it? Because, and I guess we could go down this a few different ways. I think I was possibly one of the people who added it first onto the spreadsheet as a topic, and it was sparked from a conversation that I'd had with my mate Danny, and his basic question was like, why do we just accept the way that society is built up and that the people in charge are the people in charge? You know, like, why is it that another human being, just because they happen to have the post of prime minister or president or whatever, has the authority to just say, this is what's happening in your life, when actually they're just another human being, like we're just all human beings? And that was the sort of, it's not my question per se, but that was the sort of basis from where the idea came from. But there are loads of other avenues we could fly on down. So
no, I like that one, because like that's really intriguing. Because when you look in like the animal kingdom, there's sort of with a lot of different social species, there's sort of natural hierarchies, right? And they establish authority in different ways, but typically it's a power play, right? Yeah. Like the toughest guy ends up on top, right?
Which is kind of a lot of ways when you look at history, or you look at various parts of the world with like monarchies and things, you know, that's basically what's going on there, just with slightly more social politic-y sort of things going on around it. But it is sort of that survival of the fittest, and the alpha male wins out, but it's not necessarily the case nowadays in the West.
Yeah, and I guess in the West, it's not necessarily the strongest. It could be a very like wide variety of factors, but
I'm going to say you've seen the person in charge of the UK, haven't you, recently? So I mean, it's
or our previous president. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that people obtain power, but I just think that speaks to the natural side of authority, right? Like there is something sort of inherent in us that like sort of defers to others or listens to others sort of naturally. And some people sort of naturally rise to that leadership position without even thinking about it, and other people just naturally follow them without even thinking about it. And it's sort of when we talk about like authority, like is it really earned or deserved, or why do we follow people? I think the first thing that my mind goes to is biology, and like we'll look at like the ant hierarchy or look at like wolf hierarchy. Like it's all over the animal kingdom, so it's really no surprise that you see it in human species as well.
I guess you grow up, don't you, with that, you know, you're a baby completely vulnerable and dependent upon your parents or whoever looks after you when you're born. And so kind of you by default in a position where you have to defer to and give reverence and respect to and undue attention towards an adult figure in your life who, provides and makes decisions on your behalf and guides you to think in a certain way. And so all of us are sort of programmed in that way from birth, with having an adult authority figure over us. And I guess that possibly has a lot to do with that sort of then further on in life, you know, that pattern sort of continuing.
So that sort of speaks like the nature versus nurture, huh? Because when you said reverence and undue attention, like those two things bother the living hell out of me. Like the idea that we worship all kinds of things, including other people, that we give them undue, like what you said, undue attention. That I think is kind of a little bit where maybe nurture kicks in. Like, not that I'm the expert that I know, but like,
as we've mentioned on this podcast a lot, none of us
are experts at anything. I'm an expert at running my mouth. That's about it. No, but I mean, you know what I'm saying, right? Like there's that sort of natural biological side of like sort of naturally following a strong or persuasive personality. But then there's also the sort of nurture side of like teaching the worship and the reverence and the almost to a point of failure.
Like one of my least favorite like sayings is respect your elders, because like I think age doesn't, I mean, often age has as a byproduct like an advancement of wisdom and love and compassion and all of those sorts of things, but it definitely isn't like a necessary component.
It's not a qualifier.
No, and I want to jump in now because I've been stum for a while, but you've just hit on a point that's really important. And I'll use my own parent, well, my own mother, who's still alive. My father's passed away, but my own mother is an example. She brought us up really well, you know, as an authority figure when we were young, and as a guiding figure. She did really well with us. There were three of us, and she brought us all up really well. However, the political views are absolutely fucking crazy, and I wouldn't trust a word on that. Wouldn't follow a word on that by any stretch of her imagination. Some of the kind of political views she has, and we disagree very much so on almost a huge aspect of things. So that's a demonstration of just because we look up to someone in a caring role as we're growing up, and they can do a really, really good job. It doesn't make them an authority in all things that we should listen to them throughout our lives in.
But I think they often can be, though, because I think you being in that situation isn't necessarily the situation that everyone finds himself in. I think you're lucky in as much as you're able to have those like independent thoughts and not be necessarily overly swayed by what your parents think. But I bet that there are lots of people who are.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say is it is neat when we can sort of reflect on and pick and choose what types of authority we give to people over us. And like that parent is a great example. Like, well, you were great at child rearing and protecting me and teaching me and raising me, but I don't give you authority over things like my belief systems or whatever. But I think Gil is right. A lot of times that authority carries well into adulthood where we carry the belief systems and the values and the precepts from our childhood that our parents put on us. And we do continue to respect them as that authority figure. To the point where some people who disagree with them struggle with that, where it's like, I still see your authority over me. So when I see that I disagree with you, now there's a conflict there rather than, oh, we just happen to disagree.
It's interesting, isn't it? And I'd love to see, there probably has been studies on this. I haven't seen any and I've not looked for any. I would be interested to know if there are any studies on this, on whether when kids, teenagers, even, adults move away from home and from the parents for the first time, whether they're going to university or wherever it may be, just moving in with a partner or whatever for the first time, how that changes their perception. And the reason I was thinking about that is because I've heard a lot of stories of people who've deconverted from religion after moving out from the parents who have those strong religious beliefs and go into like college and stuff where they don't have those authority figures over them telling them what to believe or encouraging them in what to believe, and they're free then to do their own investigations and find their own ways.
Yeah, they're exposed to multiple authority figures with multiple points of view. I think that's what college does the best. Is it's not just that there's a battling of ideas or contrarianism there, but it's more like, okay, now you have multiple authority figures who are telling you all these different things, and that forces your mind to deal with the information, right? So I don't think that college like deliberately deconverts people, like I've heard some people say,
No.
you know, like that is definitely something I've heard from fundamentalists, is to stay away from college for those reasons. But I think that it does sort of naturally deconvert people because of that being forced with, hey, there's multiple people here that I respect. I respect their opinions. I respect their intelligence, and they have different points of view. And now I have to deal with this. Like my brain has to process it.
Fundamentalists saying that they don't want people to go into higher education is a very blatant admission that like indoctrination and that undue authority that they have over people when they're in that closed-in environment, surrounded on all sides. I can't remember how to start my sentence, but they're specifically keeping that person in that place with those people in order to continue that faith, because they know full well that people exposed to other points of view and exposed things in the world will, well, I mean, lots of them do, but like, it's certainly not a blanket statement, but lots of them will change their mind about things because they just see other points of view.
Yeah, so that kind of brings up an interesting question in my head, or like a point of discussion, is the different types of authority. And like the two that I specifically have in mind is the kind that is put over you by, say, an outside body, like say a government, and then the kind that you put over yourself, like when you choose a religion. And so, and there is a little bit of like gray area there for people who maybe were brought up in religion and didn't necessarily have that sort of free choice aspect, where maybe they just sort of naturally believe it because that's what they've been exposed to. But when you're choosing to have a religious belief and you're choosing to put that authority over you, that's a completely different kind of authority than the one where it's like, well, this is the government. If you choose to break these laws, there's punishments. And so there's this sort of compulsion, right, to accept that authority versus.
Is that not more of a contract than an authority?
I mean, yeah. So there's even more nuance there, I guess. Yeah. So there's breakdowns, but like say a police officer pulls you over for speeding.
You can't opt out of that contract at that point, can you?
What's that?
You can't opt out of the contract at that point.
And is it really a contract if you never sat down and negotiated it, right?
Yeah.
Like you can sign a marriage contract and they're pretty standard, but I don't think a lot of people negotiate their weddings, but they certainly have the option to, and you sign that contract like as something you sit down and decide to do. But when you're born in a specific nation with specific laws and specific authorities over you, you don't have any necessarily like choice in the matter. You don't get to go to the table and negotiate which laws you think are reasonable. So I don't know. I think there's a lot of authority there. But it seems like extrinsic, like it's being put on you versus this sort of religious authority. To me, I think there are those people who they're putting it on themselves. Like they're putting themselves under that authority deliberately.
There is that. I slightly disagree with the you're born into a thing and you've got no choice, because in some countries you have. There's nothing stopping people in, obviously, we're not talking about Afghanistan and the Taliban here, but in some countries, you can run for office, you can try and make the difference and put your voice forward and get the support and get your voice heard.
I do agree with that, but that's different from a contract, right? Like a contract is every individual citizen gets to sit down and say, I agree to this. But a lot of times it's a more passive process, don't you think? Like we just kind of roll with the rules or break them and get the consequences. But you know what I'm saying?
But we do that by choice. We can. The thing is with this this is going really off on a tangent.
No, I love it. Let's do this.
I've I have one of my arguments against veganism is that there's nothing stopping anyone going and living in the woods somewhere and surviving off the land and living exactly how they want to. We all choose to live in this society. We in a way we all choose to abide by the rules because it benefits us to have an income or a nice warm roof over our heads, or and not everyone's in the position. I'm talking generally because obviously not everybody's in that position where that is what happens to them. But you know, you can choose to go out and like work in general and have a roof over your head and a nice warm meal in your belly and watch TV or listen to music or whatever it is you enjoy doing. And that's kind of, you get your payback from doing that. And by doing that, you have to abide by certain rules in society to be allowed to do that. You can't enjoy that life and then just suddenly decide to go and slit someone's throat because you've, in a way, you've broken that contract and you're going to be removed from society for doing that. But you understand that.
I think you do at a point. Yeah. So I agree, like, sort of on the surface with everything you say. I just think that there's a little bit more nuance there in, like, say you're born into a country, like, yes, you have the choice to leave, but the majority of people aren't going to. So I guess that the difference is, like, that I'm trying to make is that person X born into X country, or person, let's say Paul born into America, right? They may have the choice to stay in America or not and abide by the laws or not, but a lot of those choices are very compulsory. Like, you don't, not every single person has the opportunity to just up and leave and go to another country. It's a process. It's difficult.
And
There's
even
a
if people
lot
go
of
through the
considerations.
process of running for office or for, getting some elected position, even then the amount of change that an individual can make is limited by, certain laws or by reasonable restrictions of, what people in that office can achieve or
just
affect.
how effective they are as politicians,
Yeah.
Like, if I want a law changed, I'd be like the last person that would be really great at having that come to fruition. Like, I don't have that personality. But no, I guess what I'm saying is, like, in general, for the average person, you're born into certain kinds of authority, like your parents, right? You have those authorities over you. You didn't pick your parents, and then you have the authority of your various social levels, from like local and small up to the big, like, federal government. Um, but then there's also authorities that we don't have to have over us, that aren't really compulsory, there's no pressure there, but we put that pressure on ourselves, right? I don't know if that makes any sense.
So let's get to those authorities then. Let's get into those. I mean, I'm assuming, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you're thinking from your own experience of the kind of choosing to go into the religious things that you did and making those choices and having those authorities over you in that respect.
That's certainly one of them. Go ahead.
Right.
I was just going to say, do you mean specifically in terms of religious figures within those religions, or like the authority of gods and things?
Well, all of it. That's what I was hoping to discuss, is like what you guys think about that, because I can think of tons of different authorities that we put over ourselves, right? Like, if you, oh my God, I had like 3 in my head, now they just flew.
You literally said, I can think of tons.
I know, and then they went blank. As I said that, they just left. It was so funny. Okay, so like joining something like the Girl Scouts and falling under their rules and regulations. For me, like being in the military, like I volunteered to join the military, and then you fall under those rules and regulations, right? So you're putting that authority over yourself voluntarily. And I do agree that to a certain point, remaining a citizen in a nation, when you have choices and options and availability, that can also become a choice that you choose to continue to do. But there are, like, say you go to be like a teacher or something, you have rules of conduct, right? That you have to follow. There's authority over you as a teacher, right?
Yeah.
You volunteered for that. You put yourself underneath that. If you didn't agree with that authority, go do something else for a living, right? Like, there's nothing forcing you.
And it's one of those as well where, like, 'cause I work in a state school, so one that's got government funding from the UK government.
Yeah.
Whatever levels of funding is a separate conversation for a separate day. But like if I'd wanted to, there's nothing actually stopping me from setting up my own school with my own educational sort of framework that's separate from the national curriculum and separate from, all those sorts of things. But still doing that, I would do that under the knowledge that I would still be inspected by the government schools inspectorate, and I would still be required to meet certain statutory requirements of safeguarding and child protection. And, the anything you do in that regard, yeah, you're right. You go into it knowing what it is that you're needing to do and what your obligations are and responsibilities are. And I think talking as a teacher as well, obviously, I have a very important position of authority over the children in my class and the other children in the school and stuff. And interestingly, since we're talking about this today, because I started with my new class for the new school year last week, and it's interesting, one of the first things I said to them was, I don't want you to respect me just because I'm a grown-up or just because I'm a teacher. I want you to respect me because I respect you. And hopefully I'll be able to show you that I do respect you all. And I really hope to get that respect back from you. Because I think, yeah, just because someone has a certain job title or someone has a specific label doesn't necessarily mean that they should be an authority figure over someone. And I think that whole conversation around respect and what have you is, yeah, sort of part and parcel of that.
I think that's sort of cool how you tie together authority and respect. But I don't think they necessarily have to go hand in hand, like definitionally.
No.
But I think oftentimes when you have like a peaceful authority over you, that's what you end up having, is that sort of respect for them. I think there's various different kinds of authority that we exercise over each other, and not all of them include respect. But I like how you said that, because I think that the most effective and peaceful type of authority is that sort of respect, where the person wants to be under your authority because of what you provide or offer to them or what you bring to the table.
Yeah.
And so I kind of like that approach that you have with your students. I think that's really neat. Like, don't just automatically respect me because I'm an adult. Respect me because I'm worthy of your respect.
Wouldn't it be nice if everybody was like that and throughout society all the time?
Yeah, there was a post on Facebook the other day. It wasn't about authority. It was about diplomacy, basically, like not using violence to solve problems, like learning how to de-escalate situations. And it sort of ties in together the same thing, where it's like, man, if everybody used diplomacy first as just a rule of thumb, like if everybody put diplomacy above like national interest, violence, whatever, I think we get a lot further. I mean, sure, we still have.
Two countries go to war, and after they finish killing each other, they have to sit down and talk and negotiate what they're going to come, have as an outcome. Well, let's just skip the bit where we kill everybody and do
the second part. Yeah. And I'm not saying it's like that easy, like snap your fingers and there's a solution.
No.
How is me sticking my army of 50,000 people against your army of 50,000 people and watching innocent, everyday people kill each other? How about we just go to the table and argue it out? And it doesn't have to be pretty, it doesn't have to be instant, but it's like you said, if all authority was deserved or earned or respected authority, how much further would we get? And if all conflict was solved through diplomacy, or at least attempted, how much further would we get? It's
and I think that thing of deserved authority is a really good point as well, Laura, because I think of like one of the most fundamental things that I care about generally in life as a person, but as a teacher and as a someone who's interested in politics and whatever, is justice and fairness. And I think when authority isn't deserved, I think that can be a big source of problems. Like, I can think, we've talked briefly, I think, before about like how the UK Parliament is split into the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and some of the people in the House of Lords, well, all of them were only elected for a start, but lots of them are there just because their ancestors happen to have been big landowners, or just because they happen to be a bishop in the Church of England, or there are things like that where they have real, legitimate, actual power as members of the House of Lords, but for reasons that, in my mind at least, are not deserved. Whereas there are people who are then elected MPs and what have you, who do deserve that power because of, it's been a result of a democratic process by local people, voting for their MP and stuff. And I think that sense of unfairness can certainly be a source of friction when it comes to different authority figures who are actually sort of occupying a very similar sort of space to one another. But yeah, with very different levels of deservingness.
Yeah, so that brings up a really good question for me, is like, when authority is perceived as being undeserved, like what it's sort of an interesting question, like what can be done about it, right? And obviously there's like, oh, revolt and revolution and war and picketing, and there's all kinds of different like things we can do to show our distaste for authority. But it's like, we literally as a group, as a society, give this authority to somebody and like agree to it, and then when we decide, wait, no, we don't want you to have that authority, it takes like damn near an act of God to get that authority removed from them. And that's interesting to me, that it's like authority can be so quickly given, but it's so hard to retract and take away.
Mm-hmm.
Is that not a safeguard though, against people taking an unfair dislike to someone in power and it being easy to get rid of them? After all, they were voted in power to start with anyway. So
like Hitler, he was voted in, and then it's a safeguard, so he stays in.
Well, that's kind of like the slippery slope, right? Like there's two sides to every coin, and I think like Gilliver, you make a good point. I think both of you make good points, like on the opposite sides. There are times where the authority just no longer makes sense and it's not necessarily valid, but we're still upholding it or respecting it because it's tradition or because changing it is too hard or difficult. And then
That
there's
just
also
brought to mind lots of the things, and it's slightly adjacent, but lots of the things to do with like the extra powers that governments have had during the COVID pandemic and stuff. And lots of people worried about like freedoms having been taken away. But that like I know, for example, the Scottish Parliament in the UK was given additional powers from the UK government to mandate things like masks and whatever else. But that power is due to be taken back away from them so that they can't, have that authority over the people of Scotland. But then it's that question of, well, just granting people additional powers and then taking them away again is a difficult thing to do. And I can't remember what my actual point was. So continue.
I don't know, but but you bring up a good illustration of when authority is granted for temporary purposes. But like that almost makes my point for me, is like, okay, once it's granted, it seems to be more difficult to take it away. Like,
like in countries where there's a military coup and the generals are like, don't worry, guys, we'll be giving back all of this power to the people very shortly. Trust us.
We promise. Yeah. Yeah, so I know we're coming up on a commercial break, and like that seemed to happen really, really fast. So I guess authority is a really captivating topic for us. But one thing that I want to delve into when we get back from the commercial break is kind of more of that, like, what makes authority authority? Like, when is it given? When is it taken away? When is like, what are the different types of authority? Because to me, it seems like it's, oh my God, there's so much wrapped up around it that makes it complicated and um tricky to talk about. Like, I just like what Gilliver said, where he was like, yeah, but it also protects like validly elected people, from getting just usurped left and right. It's a tricky subject. So
it is. It's a very nuanced subject with I don't think it necessarily has right or wrong answers either. It is something that should be battered backwards and forward and looked at kind of the different sides or opinions or shades of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, one thing that I want to talk about, hopefully when we get back, is like, when should you, like, I hate the word should, but should you respect an authority versus when should you specifically not respect an authority? So anyway, on to commercial break, and then I'm sure we have lots more to talk about.
Okay, so what have we got coming up? We'll start with Laura.
All right. So on this last Monday, I was on The Crucible talking about abortion. So as I'm recording that will be happening tonight. As of the airtime, that happened last Monday. So if you go onto the secular, I always get this messed up, Promethean Secular Frontier, check out their Crucible playlist. And I was on the last one discussing abortion rights and the new laws in Texas.
You were on there with some pretty interesting people. I think you were on there with my friend Cynthia McDonald.
Cynthia and Deborah Grace. Yeah, like a whole bunch of them. There was a panel of 6 of us. So
brilliant.
Yeah.
Go and check that out. As of yesterday, I was on the Perspective with my friend Mr. Rarity.
Oh, nice.
Tormenting him. It's a pairing that has been like touted for so long, and everybody keeps wanting us to work together and pushing us. We did recently the non-profits, and we were on there with Cynthia McDonald and Jenna Miu, who were both amazing. Absolutely wonderful. That was so much fun. But yeah, I love working with Secular Rarity. We get on so well together, on and off
pairing.
Screen, so
yeah. I still want to do a Perspective with you one of these days.
Yeah, I'm sure it will happen.
We'll make it happen.
We'll bully Ethan until he lets us do it. Well, what was that phrase you used that time when you were talking about being a squeaky wheel? Or
oh yeah. Squeaky wheel gets the grease.
I'm sure we'll get some grease.
Yeah.
Ricardo.
Right, I normally talk about the Facebook group, which I will mention in passing, but today, as a special treat, I just wanted to talk about our Linktree page because it's the place where you can get to everywhere you need to go. So on there you can find, it's linktree/skeptic hangout, or as I've said before, it's hard to say, linktr.ee/skeptic hangout. But on there we've got links to our YouTube channel, to our podcast feed on Spotify, our Apple podcast feed, our Google podcast feed. It's got our Stitcher podcast feed, our Facebook page, our Facebook discussion group, our rather quiet Instagram feed. And I see Jill over smiling. He set it up and there's like 2 posts on there. But the reason I highlight all of those different places because I often, with lots of shows, like I consume a lot of ACA content. And so like often
as you should.
Yeah, as I should. Yeah, indeed. As people should.
Everyone should.
But like I often start watching like Talk Heathen or Atheist Experience or something on YouTube, but then end up busy or doing something else. So I always then catch the podcast when I'm out and about doing jobs or what have you. And so it's always handy to be subscribed on various places so that you can always catch the rest of the show when you've started watching and get distracted. So make sure you subscribe to wherever is most suitable.
I love it. All right, everyone, back to the show. All right, everyone, welcome back from the commercial break. And before we left, we were talking about the different types of authority and when you should and or shouldn't respect it. So, Jilliver, I'm going to give you a chance to take this away.
You're going to plug me straight into
put you in the fire.
Skepticism. And because I'm going to choose that as an example. When should we trust an authority? If we're discussing a subject with someone, when should we count someone as an authority? Is it right to count someone as an authority? Is it indeed a fallacy to count someone as an authority?
Oh, so I just want to interject here because you're talking about 2 different kinds of authority now. One is like the power that someone has over somebody else, but the authority you're talking about is the right or the ability to speak on a specific topic or subject, like whether or not
authority of knowledge.
Yes, yeah. So there's a good distinction to make, and I love that you made it. And go.
Yeah, so if we're having a discussion about, let's say, whether the Earth is 6,000 years old or whether it is 4.8 billion years old, I think the current estimate is something around those lines, give or take a billion years. It's a billion years between friends.
I mean, it's nothing. Chump change.
Do you trust the person who's pointing you to a YouTube video more, or do you trust the person who's pointing you? And I'm going to be very specific here, so I don't commit the fallacy, which we'll come on to shortly. Do you trust the person who's pointing to the work done by the experts in the field, which demonstrate via evidence that the Earth is X amount of years old. You know, what's the best authority to use in those situations, and why do we think?
YouTube video, because it's quick.
Absolutely. Yeah. And Google, because Google's never wrong. Duh. Conversation over. Next topic. Let's go.
I think skeptically, an unsourced Wikipedia page is the way to go as well. That's also a good route to truth.
I love it. Okay. So that's a very, very interesting question, because it seems to have a really obvious answer. Like, yeah, the people who have done the research, people who've done the work, run the tests, done the math.
And you've just committed the fallacy.
Right. Well, no, I mean, so you're talking about the research of the people. Okay. Like,
this is how easy it is to do.
Words,
this is why
words matter. Words matter, people. Okay.
This is exactly why I brought it up.
Because, like, if you just quote something that someone who's an expert in a field just randomly replied to someone on Twitter with, that doesn't in any way, shape, or form have any sort of. No, hang on. I'll retract what I'm saying. Often people are experts in something and have done lots of extensive work and have read a lot of things and written a lot of things, whatever it is, know loads about that subject. But just because someone says it on Twitter or says it in an interview doesn't mean it's true just because they said it. If you're referring to work that person has specifically done, the work they've done is incredibly important. But as well, you've got, if it's done rigorously and under peer review and all of that lot. But even then, that does also take skill in order to discern information from academic literature and whatever else, which is certainly not a skill that everybody has, and that is a really easy skill to sort of lose or misuse, or, you know, it's hard.
Yeah, but then you add in like this other layer of complexity where who or what you consider an authority figure might be different from person to person. So when you ask that question, Jill, over about who would you trust, this or that, or what would you trust, like this information or this YouTube video, the problem with that question isn't that it's not a fair one, because it is. The problem is that people oftentimes pick and choose who they see as authority figures. So once someone has determined that, like, well, the scientist doesn't really know what they're talking about, well, now any data that they gather that they're pointing toward may not be relevant to that individual. Not that it's not sound or valid, or that it might have tons and tons and tons of support and evidence to back it up, but what do you do when that individual refuses or chooses not to see that kind of work as even deserving of authority?
See, that's a question I can't answer, because that is my lifelong kind of mission, is to educate people. I consider, more than anything else, I consider myself an educator, and that is what I try and educate people into, that way of thinking of, you know, let's delve into why we might not be thinking in a way that is necessarily the best way to ascertain the truth or the likely truth of a proposition.
Right.
Because it's not an easy thing to do. We are, and it's a laugh here because I say this all the time, our minds are incredibly crap. They really are crap. We get tricked by our own brains so often. And it's so hard to even regulate ourselves. So you've got to be very careful when you go and speak to someone else and you're trying to not necessarily convince them of a proposition, but just talk about methods of how to investigate propositions.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to be so careful not to like fall into the bad thinking yourself when you're doing that, because it's so easy to do.
And then is it that close line between like all of these things we're talking about and then like going into conspiracy sort of, you know, like we've talked about COVID already this episode, but like you see lots of people who are questioning the studies done on mask wearing, or questioning the studies
exactly my point
to test the safety of vaccines and all of those sorts of things. Because then suddenly, well, of course I'm not going to trust the virologists and immunologists and whatever else, because they're, you know, backed up by big pharma who just want to rake in all the money. And then it's like, that seems on the surface to be a reasonable sort of reason to maybe doubt something, you know, like if people have got financial interests in something like earning money from people buying vaccines or governments buying vaccines, that does seem like a really reasonable thing to say, well, yeah, this is peer reviewed and whatever else, but there's things behind the reason why they're doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And then at what point do you sort of ignore the fact that that is a legitimate concern that someone can have, but actually we still kind of believe the science that is come out of that?
Yeah, and some arguments for or against an authority can sound really reasonable even when they're not. Like when you talk about like the young earth creationists sort of arguments, right? They can be very, very educated and they can speak to a lot of the actual science done. And then they can just say something as simple as, well, that's a guess. Well, that's a speculation, right?
Yeah.
And why is your speculation any more valid than my speculation, right? And it kind of undermines a lot of the actual work and research that's gone into it, but it does it in a way that to the outside person, like it's very, very compelling. So now you have these multiple authorities vying for attention, and you sort of get the one with the most, and I'm not saying this is true overall or for every single argument or every single person, but you get the one that's like the most sort of simple and elegant tends
Mhm.
to win out over the more complicated, but perhaps more true authority on the subject. Or now we're moving kind of from authority to truth, like what is true and not true. But
And I think as well that takes me back, and I'm a teacher, everyone. I'm going to bring that up again. I'm conscious as a teacher, though, as well, that, yeah, I don't, like I talked about respect and stuff earlier on, but educationally, I am an authority figure for the children in my class because they certainly don't have time to access the peer-reviewed literature, which goes on to explain about, whatever it is I'm teaching. Like, they do have to trust the words I'm saying based on the fact that I've learned it myself in the past and have prepared for the lessons I'm teaching. And I think when I was a child, people in church filled a very similar role to me as an authority figure in terms of, well, if I'm believing the people who are teaching me at school in the same way, I'm going to believe the people who are teaching me at church, because the parallels there were very, very similar.
good point.
Whereas nowadays, I obviously put more I put more behind the, one of those over the other. Like I give more credence to one than the other. But yeah, very similar role when I was a child, and still that's obviously very prevalent today.
I feel very tempted to pull this off my Richard's book review.
Just do it.
Because
Just do it.
you've talked about education and religion, and that's the British Journal of Religious Education. So that's an actual scientific publication which goes into the studies. It has published studies in and things. So you can get authority can be trusted in a certain field. Like Richard was saying, it's backed up by peer review. It's the best method we have. It doesn't necessarily mean it's true. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to or you should follow them. But it's literally the best method we have when you get into the scientific method and you get into, articles, peer-reviewed articles in recognized journals and things. I don't think there's, going back to the point I raised at the start after the break, I don't think there's any kind of higher authority that is better in guiding, and I'm not going to say being true or but guiding the way that we move forward. And it's been, it's demonstrable, because that's how we have technology. That's how us three are speaking now. It's how things progress through the scientific method. If it wasn't for the scientific method, we wouldn't be communicating now. We wouldn't have an audience. We wouldn't have the internet. We wouldn't have these devices we're talking into. And, Richard wouldn't be able to be a teacher and travel to work on transport. And, everything is kind of, it demonstrates that kind of authority is the best we have in giving us a grounding of understanding the world. And I want to stress that doesn't mean you should trust it outright just because it is a scientific authority, because we don't want to fall into those traps.
And that is something that sort of the non-scientific community sort of gets right, that we need to own a little more, is that science is a process. It's not a person, it's not an establishment, right? And it isn't necessarily right or wrong. It's a means by which we draw conclusions, and those conclusions are not 100% of the time entirely correct or correct at all. There's a lot of times where we find out that we're wrong, and we have to
do
change our way of
personify
thinking.
science a lot in the way we speak, though, don't we?
do.
Science thinks this.
And I think that
Yes.
that gives sort of the anti-scientific or non-scientific community a lot of ammo, because there isn't enough humbleness among humility. Thanks. I was like, the word just
I don't think it's necessarily a lack of humility in all cases,
Not
although
all
I do think it's a case of, but I mean, if you have a look at, for example, if this isn't going off topic, although it's going to sound like it, if we look at kind of the science that studies the beginning of the universe, and a lot of those scientists will use the phrase, the universe came from nothing. But of course, they don't mean that. They don't think that the universe came from nothing. They're just using colloquial layman's language to kind of. But a lot of people who don't understand the specifics,
it gives them arguments
that the universe came
it.
from nothing. The scientists and
I think in a similar way, didn't Einstein talk about the universe in ways that kind of were peripherally related to God, or like heavens on, like the way he described certain things people jump on? It's like, look, Einstein saw this and he thought that there was a God who created the universe and things, but like often it's just like all of those ideas are so ingrained in our language, aren't they, all the time, that you almost can't get away from them sometimes.
And there's even quotes from Einstein, I don't know how accurate they are, of him correcting that and very sort of clarifying what he meant. And I can't remember the terms he used, whether it was divine or greater power or something like that. It was something very vague that is often used with religious or theistic ideas. But yeah, I think that is a place where we sort of do ourselves a disservice when it comes to the authority that one has over certain types of information, is when we fail. It's like we want so bad to present it as the truth that I mean, we in the broad sense, like not everybody does it, but we sort of fail to say, well, and here's the shortcomings, and here's the questions, and here's the gaps, and like this is the information we have now. Like I love how Gilliver earlier said that the scientific method has been the best that we have so far for coming up with these solutions and these advances and stuff like that, and this greater understanding of our reality that we're stuck in, right? He didn't say this is the best method. He said this is what we have so far that works the best. And I think that a lot of times we think it'll undermine the authority of a professional to include those caveats, but I honestly think that including them gives them a stronger leg to stand on, because there's less than for dissenters to kind of tear down. Like, nope, we've already covered that. We've already acknowledged that. Let's move on.
If we as communicators, because that's what we are, if we as communicators can highlight that science isn't perfect, it takes away the power of those who are using that as a weapon. So if I'm not picking on creationists here, because a lot of
pick on creationists.
Go for it.
But if a creationist comes along and tries to use the shortcomings of science to an uneducated audience, saying, well, look, it's vague, it doesn't, it's and if we're already telling people that, then people understand that that's part of the shortcomings of science and the scientific method. So they'll already understand that.
Exactly.
It's when and that power that those creationists have in using that as a weapon won't be there anymore. The problem lies when we sit here, and I'm pretty sure I'm guilty of it. We're probably guilty of it as a show of doing it in the past. But there are times when we sit here and say, "Oh, science is this, and science is that, and science is the other," and we don't include those caveats. And we don't think to, because talking amongst ourselves, we understand that it has shortcomings.
Yeah.
Right.
But as communicators,
some of the shortcomings of science are some of their strengths. The fact that you never
definitely
get a definite answer and can always change and improve and move forward. Some people, like lots of religious people, would point to the fact that, well, you don't have an answer and you change your mind and whatever else as a weakness. But it's one of the inherent strengths of the process.
One of the main kind of criticisms you get from staunch religious people is that, well, you don't know the answer either. And that's not a bad thing.
That is something we should
It's not
lean
a bad
into.
thing.
We need to talk about, so now I'm trying to keep it on authority as much as possible. So now we're talking about the authority of what we can determine is so academic authority. What we can determine is right or wrong in terms of knowledge, right? We need to be able to lean into that, and that actually I think that lends the subject or the individual more authority when they can say, sure, we both don't have the answer. Let's start there. Let's
Yeah.
discuss what we know versus what we don't know. And let's discuss your claims versus my claims. And let's weigh them against each other and leave it at that. Right. I think you're absolutely right. And I think I've seen more and more science communicators leaning into that and doing that more often. I think that traditionally in the past, that hasn't been done as much. And that
Then
may
the
have,
authority comes from the information as opposed to the professor or the doctor or the whoever, it's the information that then can win out.
Yeah, and there has been times in, maybe, I don't know, I don't want to put a figure on it. I want to say kind of the last 20 years or so, where people like Richard Dawkins have been kind of, especially in our kind of community where we do talk to theists and things quite a lot, has been like labeled this kind of superhero of atheism. And of course, it's not. And it's as simple as that. And kind of, and you're again falling into another fallacy, because there's a fallacy called the fallacy of false authority. Richard Dawkins is an authority in biology. That's his field of expertise. Is not an authority in religious studies or in theology or in biblical criticism or any of those things. And yet that's where he's kind of garnered a lot of his like big famous status from commenting on those things. So it's not to say, go on.
No, sorry, you weren't finished. Go on.
No, I was coming to the end. Carry on.
Okay, I was just gonna say like that goes back to what I was saying in the beginning about that sort of like almost like human worship, or I can't remember how Gil put it, but it was like reverence, right? I think authority is the best granted to people when it's done conditionally, right? Like, okay, you're authority on this subject, but you still need to back up your claims. You're an authority on this subject, but you can still be wrong. You're an authority on subject X, but not necessarily subject Y. Or you could be like a botanist and really, really like have a PhD in botany, but you could still know more about pizza baking than your neighbor, right? And so you can still be more of an authority on how to do like break oven pizzas than your neighbor. So a lot of times we become too rigid in our understandings of authority, and we fail to see that we need to be a little bit more nuanced about what specific authorities an individual has. Now, we're still on the subject right now of academic authority. So when you talk about like say Richard Dawkins, for example, like his stuff on gender and transgender and stuff, I haven't heard anything recently of him. So, and I don't like study it or follow it. So I'm going back on old tweets of his that were very like anti-transgender, right? And it was a huge uproar a while back. Because he's a biologist, is he necessarily qualified to discuss chromosomes and gender and transgender and the psychology of it and the hormones involved and like the whole gambit of it? Maybe he is, and maybe he isn't, right? But we should ask that question before we get in like this huge uproar over whether or not he's right or wrong, or whether he's being transphobic or what he's actually saying. Like maybe stop it. I haven't analyzed his statements in like at all. I've just heard about them.
There's that whole thing then as well of like, because and again, I don't know lots about that specific aspect of his sort of history and what his opinions are, but like because of that, people would then disregard other things that he said because there's a transphobe, we shouldn't listen to him. Whereas actually they're separate issues, aren't they? Like I understand not necessarily wanting to support someone personally who you disagree with fundamentally, but if they are legitimately an authority in a subject or have produced authoritative works or whatever, you know what I'm saying, like you shouldn't necessarily discount the things that are that because of other things that they've said which are not.
Right. Yeah, it's that allowing that wiggle room, allowing an authority figure to have the ability to be wrong and to call them out on being wrong and then move on, but still have authority in some places, but not automatically grant them authority in others, or just verify what they're talking about. I would love to go and check his actual quotes, because if he's saying, hey, biologically it got this bit wrong, here's how it actually is, and he's correct, then we should embrace that, and the trans community should embrace that and say, yes, if, and this is a big if, because I haven't read his quotes, so I'm not agreeing with him in any way, shape, or form, but I'm also not disagreeing. I'm saying, if indeed he does make a good point in there, that point should be embraced, and we should be able to work within it and say, okay, yes, and then here, let's further the understanding of transgenders, for example, by including this information. Or if he's wrong, being able to illustrate how or why or where the studies are.
Because
And
I think
move
in a
on.
lot of ways that specific issue as well involves a lot of learning for people who are not directly involved, you know, who don't have a direct impact in their life personally. You know, there is so much to know and learn about the experiences of trans people and all of that sort of stuff. There is a process of learning that goes along with that, and people can change their minds and their opinions can develop.
I agree with Laura, but I got to say, and I say this from someone else who's not looked into it too deeply, but I don't think that was what he was doing. I think it was just making kind of transphobic remarks.
And maybe he was. Like like I said, I didn't read the remarks. I didn't look too much into it. I just saw his name splashed all over Facebook, and like, okay, whatever. It just wasn't something that compelled me enough to look into. So yeah, I mean, if he was just blatantly transphobic, then he was blatantly transphobic. I think the point though is still like what you said. It's still pick and choose, even from among an authority figure. You know, like maybe not everything they say is worth listening to. Like Trumpsters, maybe, you know, analyze each and every single one of his statements for validity instead of any of them, all of them.
I think that's good advice, whoever you're talking to.
Yeah.
Anyway, whether it's someone who's kind of supports someone like Trump who you're not a big fan of, or whether it's someone you're a huge fan of, like you know, like an activist of some sort, or you might be a huge fan of. Everybody's prone to getting things wrong and making mistakes, so always analyze everything they say, even us.
I like it. Well, and just to put out that disclaimer, I'm not. We're not authorities. Period. So, you know, analyze us to death, but but we're also not out there making that claim. Before we end, because we're getting kind of close to the end, we talked a lot about academic authority. But I kind of wanted to get back to the idea of the sort of more rule of thumb authority, or like government authority.
You made the mistake of starting with me, didn't you? And we went down a rabbit hole.
Was it a mistake though? Because it was a good conversation. And I like that there's two different or multiple kinds of authority. I'm sure we could get into much more than just the two, but
my moral authority.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Oh, damn. We should have had more time for this. Yeah. Well, hell. No, I kind of wanted, before we ended, to touch on the idea of when is it appropriate to not listen to an authority, right? It's an established authority. Everyone's there to follow it or whatever. When is it a good idea, and how is it a good idea to not listen to that authority? What do you guys think?
I think that's nuanced. I think it's very dependent. Sometimes if it's the leader of a country, let's say, without naming any names, who's blatantly making bad decisions, I think you can kind of, a lot of times you can feel kind of the wave coming up against them. You intuitively know that they're wrong, because everyone around, I don't want to commit the argument ad populum, but you know, if so many people, and you can analyze the thing yourself, I'll correct myself, if you can analyze a thing yourself, and you can like say to yourself, I've got a reasonable evidence to suggest that this person's wrong, and then you've got all these people around you all saying this, I think you can feel the shift. You can feel the kind of shift, and you can feel the energy and the movement and things. And that doesn't necessarily have to be someone who you agree with or disagree with, or someone who's in power, because there have been alternative leaders in Britain in the last few years who've really had this kind of, they never got into power, but they kind of had this push and this movement behind them to like, and became like more like a figurehead. And, and to some people, a spokesperson and a grand authority, they weren't in power and they weren't necessarily saying bad things, but you had the same kind of movement, you had the same feeling about them. So I think it all depends. Then you get down to the kind of, if you're at work and your boss says something that's untoward, should you question that? What are the risks of questioning that? There's so many nuances into and in this question that it's kind of hard to answer with one answer. I think in some cases it's down to an individual appraisal of cost, risk, benefit, and in other cases it's a case of looking and seeing what people are saying around you and analyzing all the different kind of opinions and thoughts that are put out there. Things like
I know obviously in the news recently has been like the Texas abortion laws and things like that. And I know it's an incredibly emotive subject for a lot of people. But like in that situation, it's hard because you could be someone who has very well thought out, legitimate, reasonable views about abortion and be on one side and the other. And I think it's hard, isn't it? Because like the law is the law, but then I don't know, at what point is it reasonable? And I think this is the question you're asking. I'm just sort of saying it again in different words, Laura, but like the law is the law, but it's that thing, isn't it? Like if you disagree with it, even for legitimate reasons, it is still the law. But then how do you counteract that if you think that the reasons you've got are big enough or worthy enough of, that fight and that battle? And so I know there's lots of pushback against the stuff in Texas, and I don't want to go into that too much because I don't know too many of the details on that. But like, yeah, I don't know. It's always hard because it's real subjective, and obviously laws and rules and things that are in place are there because people have made them such. So like, I might disagree with the fact that there's loads of roads around my house which are 20-mile-an-hour speed limits, but like they're the rules there because people have had reasons for doing that in the first place, and I might disagree with them vehemently, but actually it doesn't affect my life too much to actually go down and try and affect change in those areas because, well, it's just a speed limit. It's not that, it's not that big of a deal. Whereas there are things which are worth fighting for because they do dramatically affect people's lives in a really significant way. Yeah, and I think if you look at the kind of, to go back to the Texas abortion law, I think if you have a look at it, it's been done in such an unreasonable way, and with such obvious bias and agenda, that something like that is pretty easy to pick apart and have a good.
I mean, it's easy to pick apart, but it's the law, right? When you're talking about people getting punished or sent to jail, so that's where there's a lot of, you talk about the nuances, and so that's where I think there's a lot of like considerations to be made. Like there might be a legitimate reason to go against an authority, but then there might be a legitimate reason to follow an authority, even though they're wrong, when the consequence is that a family loses a father or a mother because now they're going to jail for helping their best friend get an abortion. And even like me discussing it just now, like I'm sat here analyzing everything I've just said, like, did I sound like I was defending those laws, or do I, like, because it is such an incredibly nuanced sort of conversation and topic, isn't it? But yeah, you're right. It still is the law with actual consequences, whether or not we agree with it, which lots of people do not. Yeah, it's difficult. Lots and lots. And that brings us to the end of the show, because we're bumping up against our time now. But and I didn't mean to end on such a somber topic, but do you guys have any closing thoughts about any of the topics that we've discussed? We can stay on this one, or you guys can delve into something else, but just a really quick, like 2 minutes. And my final thought would be just like authority in general. A lot of times, in my experience, what keeps us following an authority seems to be kind of like fear-based, right? There's a consequence if I don't do this, or I have to follow them or else, right? And so that is one thing that we didn't really delve into too much.
Yeah.
But that is something that I wanted to just throw out there as my closing comment, just for food for thought. Maybe on the discussion boards, we can get more into that. And what do you guys think for your closing thoughts?
I was just going to say about, sorry, Jova, I'll carry on going since you've stopped and I'm still talking. I've lost my train of thought now, though. Damn. What was I thinking? Oh, yeah, here's what I was thinking. I think all of us can really easily fall into the trap, and I think Jova mentioned it earlier on, of like choosing authority figures in our lives who are either sort of well-known or political figures or whatever, and like worship them as idols and go along whatever they're saying. But even if you think they're saying what they're saying for good reasons, you should always still skeptically analyze what they're saying before like making decisions in your life based on the things that are being said. That was long-winded and convoluted, but hopefully it made sense.
I'd like to say something nice and wise and skeptical, but Richard's just done it. So I'm going to go a different direction.
And not nice and not wise and not skeptical.
No, not at all, no. The thing is, as we've touched upon, and as I've already said, it's such a nuanced conversation. It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of discussion. It's not a right or wrong discussion. Sometimes we have to make the decision that it's better for us to trust an authority, even if we're not open to all the facts, because it appears like they've got our best interests at heart, or it appears like they are doing the right thing. And sometimes you have to turn around and you have to fucking punch them in the face because they're wrong. And it is a nuanced conversation. There isn't a right answer. And it sometimes it's situational. A lot of the time it's situational. It's a great subject. We should do another episode on it.
Absolutely. As with all of our subjects, we need to start doing like 3-hour podcasts. Just really run each subject into the ground.
Nobody wants to listen to us.
Nobody wants to. And this is the end, ladies and gentlemen. So thank me for your ears having to deal with this no longer. No, I want to thank everybody for listening. This was a really cool subject, and I think we got like just bits and pieces into various subjects surrounding authority. But it's a very, very, very nuanced conversation. So everyone, jump on Facebook, give us your thoughts, start some discussions, ask some questions, especially if they're controversial around authority, maybe following it versus not following it or that kind of stuff. Get on there and get some conversations started. But in the meantime, thank you for joining us. I am Laura.
Richard.
And this has been Skeptic Hangout. Until next time.
Keep questioning.
Interrogate your beliefs.
And please stay skeptical.
Please. Bye-bye.
I thought you were going to burst into song then, Jilliver, when you started.